Yes, fantastic. Okay, let me do this. I'll just do it like this so I can continue to see everybody as well. So, okay. Hi, I'm Megan Mackey. My colleague who also worked on this with me is not able to join us, but that she is Dr. Natsuko Takemae. We are at Central Connecticut State University in the state of Connecticut in the country of the United States of America. So what this is we did, it's called experience-based UDL. UDL stands for Universal Design for Learning applications, building bridges to overcome barriers to learning. So the purpose of this was for us to identify barriers to students' own past learning. So all of us were students at one point. So this was a matter of us taking a look at, or having our students take a look at their past learning experiences and identify barriers that they had to their learning. And then to take a look at them, because they all want to be teachers, and identify what changes they would have made if they had been the teacher in that classroom. And then we asked them to apply the Universal Design for Learning framework in order to remove those barriers. So the rationale for this is that we want to create an equitable and inclusive education. And so we want to remove barriers to learning for all students in the general education curriculum. And I listed there's a couple of those, are some laws, United States laws that that speak to why we would be doing this. And so here's a little bit of the background research. Here is that Limo took a look at learning and our own autobiographies, our own experiences in learning, and then how we then carry those into classrooms as teachers. That students remember the most pleasant and challenging experiences they had. And then John Dewey, who's a major education scholar, looked at the reflection on the theory of how we develop our knowledge and understanding. A number of authors looked at reflective practice, and then learner and teacher identity was significant to this study. So here are our main research questions. So teacher candidates, those are people who are our current students, so in our teacher preparation programs, so we call them teacher candidates. What did those teacher candidates, someday to be teachers, soon to be teachers, identify as barriers to their own past learning experiences as a learner, as a student? How did they apply those Universal Design for Learning frameworks to remove those barriers? And then what strategies did they use to overcome those barriers? And I'll dive into each of those a little bit further. So the methodology was, we had 63 graduate students, 36 were female, 27 male. You can see the average age of the females, average age of the males, and they were from a lot of different subject areas. So some were studying to be special education teachers, some were looking at history, some were English, some were math, some were Spanish, and some were science. So we had quite a mix of people in different fields looking back on their experiences. So here's the breakdown of how many we had for each focus area. So this was a special education course, Intro to Special Education. In the United States, that is for students who have a hard time achieving in a typical classroom. And so what we do is we do testing to then determine that they need some type of specialized education. So this was a teacher certification program. So asynchronous, so it was online. This was completely online. There was no set meeting dates. Students got 1 credit for it, and there was 3 different classes, so 3 different sections of the same class. It was a required class, and we covered a lot of topics, including overcoming learning barriers. That did not flick, sorry. Okay. So here again, in picture format so the course activities and discussions where we talked about barriers and how do we increase access for all students. So basically remove those barriers or help students get around them. And then we want to design our lessons or our instruction as educators to address the variation in students and the variability. And then we're looking at applying the UDL guidelines. So there are 2 slides here. I'll get into what the Universal Design for Learning guidelines are for those of you who aren't aware. So the barriers, so there's a set, we had given them 12 specific barriers we wanted them to take a look at. And we discussed them in depth. And then what we did was, so basically the instructor would talk about, okay, the content was too abstract. So I just couldn't make any connection to it. And the supervisor, I'm sorry, the instructor gave them an example. And then maybe the outcome wasn't clear, or it was too much. The teacher had expected too much of the student. Maybe it was not relevant at all to their life. Maybe it was too complex. Maybe it was something they just weren't interested in, or maybe they lacked the skills to be successful. So we gave them 12 barriers to think about a situation and then apply, and then say, okay, well, this is an example of I didn't have the background information. So we gave them the 12, but then we noticed when we did our analysis that two other categories, we created two other categories. So situational life stressors were things like, like a family member was sick and they were just, their mind was somewhere else. They had significant anxiety or something was going on that. So something in their life, there was financial concerns. So something like that. And then other academic, maybe they had an undiagnosed disability that they didn't know of at that point. And so there were enough pieces of data that included these ones that didn't fit in any of the 12 categories that we decided to go ahead and create two categories based on what the data yielded. Excuse me. So here is just this is the snapshot of the Universal Design for Learning guidelines. And so these are significant in our field and we're in our university and in our programs, because all of these examples help provide access to all students. And so what we had asked the students in this class was to then say, okay, well, let me take a look at what was the barrier here? Like what was missing and what could I have done? So what is an example of what I could have done here? So I mentioned in this previous slide here, maybe I struggled as a past student because I didn't have the background information. So what we'd be looking for a student to do here is to say, okay, right here under provide options for comprehension, the very first bullet is activate or supply background knowledge. So we were looking for students to make that connection, say, I didn't have the background knowledge. This Universal Design for Learning guidelines specifically says, hey, you need to activate background knowledge in a student, and if they don't have it, you have to give that to them. So we were looking for them to make that connection. So that was the first step in the process that we were looking for. So the data analysis, as I said, it yielded those two additional categories, but let me show you the result. Oh, so I'm sorry, so the data analysis, there's actually 3 of us who did the analysis. And what we did was we all independently coded all 63 assignments. And we identified what category we believed the student had suggested. So that's back up here. So I would go through and say, okay, of these 63, how many ended up and identified quantity as being an issue? How many said interest? How many said strategies? And then the 3 of us came together and we had to then agree on the number of things in these, I'm sorry, the number of the frequency, I guess, basically within each category. And that's when we came together, the 3 of us came up with these 2 separate categories. So here are the results. Here's what we identified. So starting from these are all the barriers that students identified. So on the left column, you see the 12, then 14. So a total of 14 barriers identified on the left. And on the right is the frequency across those 63 papers. Within each paper, they had to do this with 4 separate memories. So that's why you have a number that's higher than the 63. So each student identified 4 different memories from their past that they identified as being a barrier. So strategies was the most frequent. And then you see this one that we ended up having to create, situational life stressor, was the second highest. And that was extremely significant to us that, okay, well, look at how many, it's the second largest category. We need to give it its own standalone category. And then the other one that we created was the other academic, and that again had a significant number. So as you go down or as you go up, it gets higher in frequency. lower is less frequent across those 63. So then the last part of this here is, let me pull up this chat. How am I doing on 5 minutes? Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so the last thing, what they do, the last step was they had to then identify strategies that they would recommend as teachers that they would then put in their lesson to help so that students did not have that barrier or face that same barrier that they did. So you have access to the presentation online, so I'm not gonna, but I intentionally included way more than I would get through and be able to read, because I just wanted you to see all of the things that we eventually came up with. And so for example, some strategy for variation in memory is teach strategies that correspond directly with the student learning strategies. So that's one. Let's look at this next one. Situational life stressors. Getting support and having personal coping skills. So for example, focusing on students' academic, emotional, and mental health. So everything, not just focusing singularly on this is the content they need to meet the threshold. Another one is skills. Maybe we can give students assessments and provide materials for exams. There's an example for skills. We have for responses, different ways of assessments and assignments. Hey, maybe instead of doing a traditional test or exam, let's, I'm sorry. So instead of just throwing students in a group and saying, go do this work, we could provide them models and set specific expectations for that group work. So then you'll see these. I'm not going to do one from every single example, but there's one on every single slide for you here that you can see. And these actually are in order from the most frequent to the least frequent. So abstractedness was had the lowest frequency. And so the big thing with this was it's too abstract, I don't understand it. It was like, well, let's give options for students to be able to comprehend it, do auditory and visual at the same time. Ecological factors, this is another thing, is just taking a look at and thinking about creating a positive learning community environment. So less bullying, have it a very safe and non-threatening space. Structured group work comes up here again. Building relationships. So having the environment, we found that, this is, if you get into Maslow's hierarchy, like until basic needs are met and we feel we are in a safe, threat-free zone, none of us are going to be as successful as we could possibly be. So it's important as educators to make sure we understand students and their needs and avoid making assumptions. And I will wrap that up here to give extra time. I think I only have like 1 minute anyway. So thank you very much.